two superpowers had just saved the world together. Within months, they began building the machinery to destroy each other. That contradiction did not arrive from nowhere. It rose from the rubble of the Second World War, when the United States and the Soviet Union faced a simple, brutal question they could not answer the same way: who would shape the peace? In 1945, Europe lay shattered. Cities were erased. Borders trembled. Armies stood where empires once ruled. The Americans brought industry, money, and a vision of open markets tied to democratic institutions. The Soviets brought exhaustion, suspicion, and a memory of invasion that made security feel like survival. At conferences in Yalta and Potsdam, leaders traded maps and promises. On the ground, reality moved faster than paper. Soviet forces remained deep inside Eastern Europe. Western allies held the West. A divided continent was not announced like a verdict. It hardened like scar tissue. And then something unexpected happened. The language of friendship curdled into warnings. In March 1946, Winston Churchill, no longer prime minister but still a thunderous voice, spoke of an iron curtain descending across the continent. The phrase landed because it matched what people could already see: controlled elections, one-party states, secret police, borders that looked less like lines and more like locks. American diplomats like George Kennan, writing from Moscow, argued the Kremlin's mistrust was structural, not personal. Containment began as analysis before it became budgets and brigades. But that wasn't the real turning point. The crisis became a system when fear met policy. In 1947, President Harry Truman asked Congress to support governments resisting communist pressure. Aid flowed into Greece and Turkey. The message was sharper than the money. The United States would not watch states fall into Moscow's orbit without answering. What came next was even more significant. The Marshall Plan offered billions to rebuild Western Europe. It was economic, yes, but it was also strategic prosperity as containment, stability as a wall made of bread and steel. Beneath the Marshall speeches, trade became a second front of paperwork and port schedules. Eastern Bloc planners tightened mutual assistance networks to match Western integration without copying it. The emergence of two German states turned Berlin into a legal absurdity: half free market, half command, one city wearing two governments. Refugees moved west in waves, a hemorrhage the East would later try to seal with concrete and guns. The Soviets saw encirclement. Washington saw insurance against chaos. Berlin, deep inside East Germany, became a flashpoint. In 1948, Stalin blockaded West Berlin, hoping pressure would force the Western Allies out. Instead, the Allies launched the Berlin airlift, a river of planes carrying coal and food in defiance. The Berlin airlift turned a besieged city into a calendar of runways, with pilots measuring survival in 1,000-ton weeks. The blockade failed. The city remained split. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization formed, binding the United States to European defense in a way Americans had once avoided. That same year, the Soviets tested an atomic bomb. The monopoly ended. The arms race ignited. Fear surged not only across Europe, but across the Pacific. In China, communists prevailed after a long civil war. In Korea, a divided peninsula exploded into war in 1950. American-led United Nations forces fought under a United Nations flag. Yet the conflict looked like superpower combat with Korean soil as the stage. Fighting froze near the old border. A truce, not a treaty, left tension permanent. Under Dwight Eisenhower, massive retaliation turned nuclear threats into doctrine, while covert action expanded in places where flags could change without tidy congressional footprints. The Korean armistice near the 38th parallel froze a war that had already fused Chinese intervention, American air power, and a landscape of trenches and rumor. At home, loyalty hearings and blacklists spread a cold dread through American culture. Joseph McCarthy's hearings turned television into a tribunal where accusation could function like evidence, amplifying fear until even skeptics monitored their own silence. Names became careers destroyed in daylight. The story was not only about missiles. It was about who could speak, who could work, who could breathe without looking over a shoulder. But that wasn't the end. In Eastern Europe, dissent sometimes rose like a flare. In 1956, Hungarians challenged Soviet control. Soviet tanks answered. Hope collapsed under treads. The message to the satellite world was unmistakable. Reform could be crushed if it threatened Soviet dominance. Meanwhile, technology raced. In 1957, the Soviet Union placed Sputnik into orbit, and American anxiety exploded into classrooms and laboratories. The space race turned the sky into another scoreboard. Hydrogen bombs made the stakes absurdly simple. One miscalculation could waste cities. Civil defense drills and bunker psychology tried to make the unthinkable feel manageable. It never really did. Generations inherited radar screens and duck and cover drills as ordinary furniture of childhood. Covert competition also ran through Berlin tunnels, listening posts, and the endless mathematics of missile throw weight, where technicians turned politics into trajectories. In May 1960, a Paris summit collapsed after Soviet capture of an American U-2 pilot exposed espionage in the open. In April 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion failed. Exile brigades met defeat on Cuban beaches, and Washington's covert fingerprints became public scandal. Embarrassment pushed both sides toward harder tests. What happened next changed everything in the public imagination. In 1961, East Germany sealed off West Berlin with concrete and wire. East Germany's secret police stitched society together with informants, until privacy itself felt compromised. Families woke to a wall where a street had been. The Berlin Wall became the Cold War photographed. Ideology made physical, separation made routine, and then the world held its breath. In October 1962, American reconnaissance discovered Soviet missiles in Cuba, close enough to rewrite the arithmetic of annihilation. For 13 days, leaders searched for a path between humiliation and Holocaust. Secret diplomacy, public brinkmanship, and a naval quarantine created space for retreat. The Soviets withdrew the missiles. The United States quietly removed Jupiter missiles from Turkey months later. Humanity stepped back from the edge. The crisis proved nuclear war was not a theory. It was a live wire. In 1963, a limited test ban treaty dampened the most poisonous atmospheric experiments, a rare moment when both sides admitted fallout traveled farther than ideology. Europe trembled again before the decade ended. In 1968, Prague's reformers tried to widen socialism with a human face. Warsaw Pact tanks erased the experiment, burying hope under doctrine again. Nuclear dread became background noise, constant and intimate. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, like the video and subscribe for more weekly breakdowns. In Vietnam, containment met a jungle war the United States could not win at a political price Washington would pay. Escalation brought body counts, protests, and a credibility wound that echoed for years. Yet even rivals sometimes chose breathing room. President Richard Nixon's opening to China in 1972 shifted triangles and reminded the world that ideology could bend when interests demanded it. The 1973 oil shock bruised Western economies and complicated a decade already thick with inflation and doubt. Arms control talks occasionally turned down the thermostat. Détente in the 1970s produced agreements like SALT, imperfect limits on strategic weapons that acknowledged mutual suicide as a bad strategy. The Helsinki Accords of 1975 traded recognition for human rights language that dissidents later used like a lever. When President Jimmy Carter emphasized human rights, dissidents listened, while hardliners in Moscow read the speeches as insult. But Détente did not erase rivalry. Proxy conflicts continued across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, where local struggles became arenas for global competition. Across Latin America, coups and interventions were often read through Cold War lenses, whether or not local realities fit the script. In Poland, shipyard strikes and solidarity later turned labor into political electricity. The Kremlin could not safely ignore. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The United States armed insurgents, turning mountains into another bleeding contest. Reagan's America ramped up military spending, rhetoric sharpened, and programs like the Strategic Defense Initiative promised shields that scientists debated and budgets absorbed. Ronald Reagan's public rhetoric often framed the conflict in stark moral terms, even as diplomats traded careful papers in Geneva. In the early 1980s, NATO exercises and misread signals sometimes spooked planners who already lived beside launch codes, a reminder that fear amplified noise into danger. The Soviet economy, already strained, bent under military cost and sinking oil prices. The Chernobyl disaster in 1986 became a public symbol of decay as well as a humanitarian wound. At the time, few outsiders grasped how thin the ice had become. Mikhail Gorbachev arrived with perestroika and glasnost. Reform meant to save the system. Instead, it loosened controls. Nationalism surged, satellites wobbled, and the center lost its grip. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell not with a tidy speech alone, but with crowds pressing through gates long guarded by guns. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. Flags changed, maps rewrote themselves. The Cold War ended not with a single surrender document in a bunker, but with a cascade of choices, failures, and releases of pressure built across decades. Its cost remains measured in proxy wars, espionage, nuclear near misses, and millions of lives touched by a rivalry that framed the world as two camps. The archives later revealed how often luck sat beside policy at the brink. The United States spent blood and treasure on containment, and sometimes mistook fear for wisdom. The Soviet project promised security through revolution and delivered stagnation and empire.